63-year-old American man fathers 29 children in a remote Ethiopian village. The women call him a prophet. The air in Goshi was thin, sharp, and tasted of dust and something ancient, like sun-baked stone. Leo, the 26-year-old aid worker, with earnest eyes and a savior's beard, felt it catch in his throat. He'd been trekking for 3 days, following whispers of a village untouched by the regional famine, a pocket of impossible prosperity. His GPS had died yesterday. The local guide, a boy from a downstream village, had abandoned him at the foot of the escarpment. Muttering about Jinn and a white ghost who guarded a forbidden spring, now, standing at the crest of the ridge, Leo saw it. Goshi was not a mirage. It was a terraced Eden carved into the ochre cliffs, impossibly green against the parched landscape. A waterfall, slender and silver, cascaded down the rock face, feeding a network of irrigation channels that snaked through fields of teff and sorghum. But it wasn't the green that made Leo's breath hitch, that made the hairs on his arms stand up in the dry heat. It was the children. Dozens of them. They were everywhere, their laughter echoing in the clean air. Toddlers with potbellies and solemn eyes, boys chasing a ragged ball, girls weaving baskets under the shade of a broad-leafed warka tree. And as they turned, one by one, to stare at the stranger on the ridge, Leo saw it. A chilling, inexplicable uniformity. They had the dark, beautiful features of the Amhara people, the same rich skin and elegant bones, but scattered among them. A statistical impossibility was a constellation of lighter eyes, eyes of hazel, of pale green, of a startling, piercing blue, and many of them, too many, had a wave of sandy brown or even reddish hair catching the fierce Ethiopian sun. A woman emerged from a circular tukul, her white shama immaculate. She was older, her face a beautiful map of wrinkles, her gaze direct and unnervingly calm. Other women followed, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and unyielding pride. They were all women, young women, middle-aged women, old women. Leo's eyes scanned the village again, frantically. He saw a few wizened old men, hunched over carving tools, their faces as ancient as the rocks. But there were no young men. No men of fighting or fathering age. Then, from the largest dwelling at the center of the village, he appeared. He was old, white, and moved with the slow, deliberate gait of a man who knew his every step was watched. He must have been in his 60s, his skin tanned to leather by decades under a sun it was never born for. His hair was a shock of white, but his eyes, even from this distance, were the same impossible blue that dotted the faces of the children. He wore simple cotton trousers and a collarless shirt, no different from the old men. But he was not one. Of them, the women parted for him, a silent, reverent wave. A small girl with fiery curls and green eyes broke from the crowd and ran to him, wrapping her arms around his leg. He placed a gnarled hand on her head, a gesture of casual, absolute ownership. He looked up, his gaze locking with Leo's across the expanse of the valley. There was no surprise in his eyes, only a weary, profound stillness. Leo felt a cold dread mix with a sickening, magnetic curiosity. This was it, the source of the whispers, the white ghost. He fumbled for his satellite phone, forgetting it was dead. He wanted to document this, to report it, to scream. But all he could do was stand there, rooted to the spot, as the old American man, surrounded by a sea of women and his unnervingly familiar-looking children, gave him a slow, almost imperceptible nod. It wasn't a welcome. It was an acknowledgement, a statement of fact, as solid and immovable as the mountain itself. Leo finally found his voice, a ragged whisper to the empty air. What in God's name is this? The question was swallowed by the vast, indifferent silence of the highlands. Silence that seemed to hold the weight of an answer he was not ready to hear. Arthur Finch had died 3 times. The first time was on a rain-slicked stretch of I-95 outside Philadelphia. He'd been at a hydrology conference. The call came at 2:17 a.m. A state trooper with a voice like gravel, asking him if he was the husband of Sarah Finch and the father of Lily Finch. The words were a formality. The tone was a death sentence. Drunk driver had crossed the median. Instantaneous, the trooper said, as if that were a mercy. Arthur remembered hanging up the phone and looking at his own hands, surprised they still worked. He had spent the next year as a ghost in his own life, a wraith haunting the rooms of a suburban home that echoed with a silence more violent than any scream. The second death was slower. A deliberate self-erasure. It happened in his garage, a year to the day after the first. The engine of his pristine sedan was running, the garage door sealed with duct tape. He sat in the driver's seat, holding a framed photo of Sarah and Lily at the beach, their smiles bright enough to burn. He closed his eyes, waiting for the carbon monoxide to claim him, to reunite him. But a neighbor, a busybody named Carol, had seen the light under the door. The pounding, the shouting, the eventual crash of the door breaking inward was an unwelcome resurrection. He woke up in a hospital, ashamed and impossibly more empty than before. He had failed even at dying. The third death was a choice. After the hospital, after the cloying sympathy of friends and the useless platitudes of therapists, he knew he couldn't stay. His life, his identity as a husband and father, was a phantom limb, an ache for something that wasn't there. He sold. The house liquidated his assets and joined the Senior Service Corps, a half-baked NGO that sent retired professionals to developing countries. It was an act of geographical suicide. He didn't want to help people. He wanted to disappear. He chose Ethiopia because it sounded like the end of the earth. He, Arthur Finch, the 60-year-old widower, the failed suicide. The hydrological engineer from Pennsylvania was going to let the heat and the dust and the sheer, grinding indifference of a forgotten place finally finish the job the sedan had. Failed to do, he arrived in Addis Ababa and was immediately lost. The city was a chaotic symphony of diesel fumes, roasting coffee, and a million competing hustles. He was supposed to be part of a team working on a dam project hundreds of miles south. But the paperwork was a mess, the bureaucracy a labyrinth. After 2 weeks of sitting in a sterile guest house, suffocating on his own irrelevance, he did something he hadn't done since he was a boy. He ran away. He paid a driver to take him north into the highlands, with no plan, no destination. He just wanted to see the mountains that looked like God's own bones piercing the sky. The driver left him in a dusty market town. For days, Arthur just walked, buying flatbread and water from villagers who stared at his white skin and his profound sadness. He was looking for a place so remote, so forgotten, that his own story would simply evaporate. He found it by accident. A fever, likely from bad water, had sent him stumbling off the barely there path, deep into a network of canyons. He collapsed, under an acacia tree, convinced this was it, the quiet, anonymous end he'd been craving. He woke to a face. A woman. Her skin was the color of dark honey, her eyes black and deep and ancient. She held a gourd of water to his lips. It was cool and clean. More women appeared, their faces a mixture of fear and wonder. They helped him to his feet, their hands surprisingly strong, led him through a narrow pass he hadn't seen. And then he was in Gochi. The shock of the green, the impossible terraced fields, the quiet industry of it all. But the strangeness settled in quickly, the complete absence of men his age or younger. The village was a society of women, children, and a handful of elders, who seemed as permanent and silent as the cliffs. They gave him a hut, fed him a spongy, sour bread called injera, and treated him with a detached, watchful care. For weeks, he was a creature in a zoo. The children would watch him from a distance, giggling. The women would murmur as he passed. He learned their problem, not through words they spoke Amharic. He spoke only English and grief, but through observation. Their waterfall, the source of their life, was slowing to a trickle. The dry season was coming, and the great cistern at the top of the village was nearly empty. Their impossible garden was dying. This, Arthur knew. This was a language he understood. Not the language of people, which had failed him so spectacularly, but the language of rock and water and pressure. He spent days tracing the path of the waterfall up the sheer cliff face, his old muscles screaming in protest. The women watched him, whispering. He found it, 300 feet up, a massive fissure in the rock hidden behind a curtain of ancient roots. The main channel of the underground spring had been blocked by a rockfall, likely years ago, diverting most of the water deep into the mountain. It was a simple problem of hydraulics and leverage. He mimed his needs to the women. Ropes, long poles, of ironwood. He drew diagrams in the dirt. They stared, then a flicker of understanding passed through them. Oh. They brought him what he asked for. For a week, he worked with the oldest men, frail but wiry, showing them where to chip away, where to anchor the ropes, how to use the poles as massive levers. The moment it gave way was biblical. A groaning shudder deep within the mountain, and then a gush of white water, a torrent, exploding from the fissure and cascading down the rock face, replenishing the waterfall, filling the cistern, breathing life back into the dying fields. That evening, the women came to his hut. They weren't whispering anymore, they were singing, a low, hypnotic chant. The village matriarch, a woman named Osmera, whose eyes held the wisdom of 1,000 years, entered his hut and knelt before him. She spoke in careful, heavily accented English, words she must have hoarded for an occasion like this. "You have brought back the water," she said, her voice raspy. "Our ancestors spoke of a man who would come from the west, a man with skin of the sun-bleached earth, who would make the mountain bleed for us again." Arthur just shook his head. It was geology, simple mechanics. Osmera smiled, a slow, knowing expression. "For you mechanics. For us, a prophecy fulfilled. You are the Mbesa, the lion, the bringer of water." She paused, her gaze so intense it felt like a physical weight. "But our thirst is greater than for water alone." That was when she told him the story of Goshi. A decade ago, a sickness, a strange and violent fever, had swept through the village. It had taken only the men. Every last one between the age of 15 and 50. It left the women untouched, the children spared, the old men to watch and remember. They had survived, they had endured, but they were dying. A village of women cannot last. Their bloodline, their history, their futurite was all evaporating under the cruel sun. Arthur listened, his heart a cold stone in his chest. He understood loss, he understood an ending. He felt a kinship with these women that transcended language and culture. He saw his own hollow grief reflected in their collective fate. Then Osmera, still kneeling, made her proposal. It was a request, so outrageous, so contrary to every moral fiber of his 60 years of Western existence, that he almost laughed. "Our roots are drying up," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper that was both a plea and a command. "Our wombs are fallow. The mountain bleeds water for us now, thanks to you. But we need you to make our people bleed life again. Be our husband, be our seed, be the father of Gochi." Arthur stared at her, then at the faces of the other women, peering into his hut, their expressions a terrifying mixture of desperate hope and religious awe. They weren't asking him to be a lover, they were asking him to be a utility, a sacred instrument. He thought of Sarah, of her warm smile and the easy monogamous love that had defined his entire existence. The thought was a profanity in this moment. He thought of his dead daughter, Lily, her future stolen from her. And he looked at the faces of the children of Goshi, children with no fathers. Children at the edge of extinction. To say no was to be the man he was, a grieving, useless old man waiting to die. To say yes was something else entirely. It was a monstrous, arrogant, and terrifying act of creation. It was a choice that would erase Arthur Finch and replace him with something else, something he couldn't yet name. He looked at Osmera's unwavering eyes and saw not a proposition but a destiny. He who had failed to die was being asked to create life on a scale that defied God. The sheer, shocking audacity of it was the first thing that had made him feel truly alive since the phone call. His throat was dry. I don't know, he stammered, the words feeble and pathetic. Azem Era did not press him. She simply rose, her joints cracking softly. The water has returned, she said, as if it were the only answer that mattered. The earth is soft again. It is ready for planting. Think on it, Mbessa. He didn't sleep that night. Sat outside his hut, listening to the impossible sound of the waterfall, a roaring testament to his own resurrected utility. He was 61 years old. His body ached. His heart was a graveyard. What right did he have to refuse a legacy when his own had been burned to ashes? What was one man's morality against a whole people's survival? The question echoed in the canyon, and for the first time he felt the seductive, terrifying pull of a purpose greater than his own grief. It felt like a temptation. It felt like a calling. It felt wrong. For the first time in years, he wanted something. He wanted to say yes. His decision came not as a word, but as an action. A week later, a young woman named Eleni was brought to his hut. She couldn't have been more than 18. Her eyes were wide with a mixture of terror and reverence. She smelled of incense and milk. This wasn't seduction. It was a ritual. Smera and the other elder women stood outside, chanting softly. Arthur looked at this girl, young enough to be his granddaughter, and felt a wave of self-loathing so profound it almost buckled his knees. He saw his wife Sarah's face, her disappointed eyes. This was a betrayal of her memory, a grotesque parody of the family they had built. But then he looked past Eleni, the village humming with a new energy, the irrigation ditches flowing, the children drinking clean water. He saw the faces of the women, not as objects of desire, but as farmers tending to their most precious crop, the future. He was not a man taking a woman. He was a tool, a plow, a vessel for a miracle they had prophesied. The shame didn't vanish, but it was dwarfed by a new, powerful feeling, duty. He reached out and took Eleni's hand. It was trembling. He led her into the hut, his own hand shaking just as much. The act itself was fumbling, awkward, and deeply sad. It was devoid of passion, a mechanical, biological transaction cloaked in sacred rites. But 9 months later, when Eleni gave birth to a healthy boy with Arthur's unmistakable blue eyes, the village erupted in a celebration so joyous, so primal, that it shook the very foundations of the cliffs. They named the boy Tinsei, which meant resurrection. And in that moment, holding the tiny, squirming child, Arthur felt the ghost of his old life finally, truly, begin to recede. He was no longer just Arthur Finch, the widower. He was Mbessa. He was the father. The years began to blur, marked not by calendars, but by births. After Eleni came Makeda, then Ababa, then Sophia. The women were chosen by the Council of Elders, led by Osmera. It was a rada, a sacred duty roster. The relationships were not romantic, not in any Western sense. They were a complex tapestry of paternal care, communal responsibility, and a strange, distant intimacy. He was father to the children and a sort of holy patriarch to the women. He never learned all of their names, thought of them collectively, the mothers. He taught his children. He was their only teacher. Using charcoal on smoothed stone, he taught them English. He taught them mathematics. He taught them the principles of engineering that had saved their village. He rebuilt the sluice gates, designed a more efficient crop rotation, and even rigged a small water wheel to grind grain. He was building a civilization in his own image, bizarre fusion of Amharic tradition and Pennsylvanian practicality. The line between right and wrong didn't just blur, it evaporated. Was it polygamy? Not really. It lacked the jealousy and possession. He was a shared resource, like the spring. Was it exploitation? He received nothing but food and shelter and a reverence that often made him deeply uncomfortable. They asked for nothing but his seed and his knowledge. He watched his children grow. His children. A brood of dozens, their features a startling mix of his own Anglo-Saxon heritage and their mother's Ethiopian beauty. He loved them with a fierce, bewildered pride that was both profound and deeply unsettling. He would sometimes catch his reflection in a pail of water, the deeply lined face, the wild white hair, the alien blue eyes. Who was this man, this prophet, this stud farmer? He had come here to disappear, and instead he had multiplied himself. Beyond recognition, the guilt, the memory of Sarah had not vanished. It had become a small, hard stone he carried in his gut, a secret anchor to a world that no longer existed. He was happy. The admission was a shock, a sin. This impossible, morally ambiguous Eden than he ever had been in his sensible, respectable life back home. He was needed. He was worshipped. He was a patriarch of a tribe he had literally created. It was a wrong and tempting and irresistible life, and he was living it. The arrival of Leo was the shattering of this sacred, fragile world. Arthur was 63. Now, he had 29 children, with 3 more on the way. The oldest, Tinsei, was a strapping 12-year-old who could already solve complex geometric problems. His daughter Salam, from a mother named Makeda, had his curiosity and a gift for languages, speaking Amharic and his own English with equal fluency. Or his legacy, a walking, breathing testament to his bizarre second act. When he saw the young, bearded white man on the ridge, a cold dread he hadn't felt in years washed over him. Leo was a specter from the world Arthur had abandoned, a world of judgment, of rules, of consequences. Leo's earnest, horrified gaze was a mirror reflecting the monstrousness of what he had done. Leo stayed for a week, a guest of the village. The women treated him with polite suspicion. The children, my children, Arthur thought, with a possessive pang, stared at him, another white man, but one who was not their father. Leo tried to be an anthropologist. He took notes. He asked questions, which Arthur's daughter Salam translated with a quiet, watchful intelligence. He asks why you are the only father, Salam said one evening, her eyes on Leo, but her words for Arthur. Tell him about the sickness, Arthur said, the lie tasting like ash in his mouth. Salam translated, her face impassive. Leo scribbled furiously in his notebook. His expression was a mixture of pity for the women and a barely concealed disgust. For Arthur, the confrontation came on Leo's last night. Sat by a fire, the stars in the thin highland air so bright they seemed to hum. This is a cult, Leo said, his voice trembling with a righteous fury. You're a king here, a god. These women are your property. These children. You've created a human zoo. You don't understand, Arthur said, his voice quiet. This village was dying. I gave it a future. You gave it a future? Or you colonized their wombs, Leo shot back. This is exploitation on a scale I can't even fathom. They call you a prophet. Back home, they'd call you a predator. They'd lock you up and throw away the key. The words hit Arthur harder than he expected. Predator. The word was a poisoned dart. He looked at his hands, the gnarled, age-spotted hands that had held newborns, that had designed irrigation systems, that had held the trembling hands of young women in a sacred, terrible ritual. I have never forced anyone, Arthur said. The defense, feeling weak even to himself, this was their choice. Their idea? Their idea? Leo scoffed, out of desperation. You came here with all the power? The white man with knowledge, fulfilling some superstitious prophecy. You could have helped them in 100 other ways. You could have brought in aid, connected them to the government. And the government would have relocated them, Arthur countered, a fire rising in him. Turned this place into a resettlement camp, made them dependent on handouts, helped them save themselves on their own terms. Their terms? Leo laughed. A bitter, sharp sound. Their terms were to turn their bodies into a breeding program for you. I have to report this, Arthur. I have to. For their sake. I'm going back and I'm telling the world what's happening in Goshi will get them proper help. Will save them from their savior. The threat hung in the air, absolute and final. Leo was going to destroy everything. Would bring the modern world crashing down on their sanctuary. The world of judgment, of newspapers, of social services and police. They would take his children. The thought was a physical blow. They would scatter his family, call his daughters victims and his sons. They would dissect his life, his love, his sin, and put it on display for the world to gawk at. He would lose everything, all over again. He had a choice. Redemption or ruin. He could let Leo go, accept the judgment of the world he'd left behind, and perhaps find a twisted sort of redemption in his own destruction. Let them call him a monster. Maybe he was, or he could protect his world. He could choose Goshi. He could choose his children, could choose the life he had built, no matter how wrong it looked from the outside. He looked past Leo, into the darkness. Asmara stood there, silent, a shadow among shadows. She had been listening. Her face was unreadable, but he knew she understood the threat Leo represented. Their eyes met across the firelight, and in that moment, a silent, terrible understanding passed between them. It was the same understanding that had passed when she first proposed their unholy pact. She would do whatever it took to protect Gochi. And now, he realized, so would he. This was the climax of his life, not the car crash, not the garage. This, the moment he had to choose which world he belonged to. The choice between the man he was and the man he had become. "You're not going anywhere, Leo," Arthur said, his voice preternaturally calm. The decision once made settled in him like a stone, cold and heavy. Leo looked confused, then alarmed as two of the village's ancient elders stepped out of the darkness behind him. They were frail, but their eyes were hard, and they carried the long, heavy poles of ironwood that Arthur had once used to free the spring. "What is this?" Leo asked, scrambling to his feet. "This is Gochi," Arthur said. "And you are a threat to our survival." Asmara stepped into the light. She spoke in Amharic, her voice sharp and commanding. The old men flanked Leo, their message clear without any need for translation. They would not harm him. Not yet. But he was a prisoner. They took his bag, his dead satellite phone, his notebook full of judgment. They escorted him to a small, empty hut at the far edge of the village, the door barred from the outside. Arthur had done it. He had made his unforgivable decision. He had silenced the outside world. He had chosen his kingdom of taboo and love and sin over the morality he was born into. He had chosen ruin to protect what he had built. He stood by the fire, the heat on his face, feeling not guilt, but a terrifying, resolute peace. He had protected his family. The days that followed were tense. Leo was a ghost at the feast, a silent prisoner who refused food, his eyes burning with hatred whenever Arthur passed his guarded hut. The village hummed with a nervous energy. They knew what was at stake. They had rallied around their Mbesa, their patriarch, against the outside threat. Arthur had never felt more their leader or more their captive. One evening, as the sun bled across the highlands, he sought out Asmara. She was sitting where she always sat, on a smooth stone overlooking the valley, her hands busy weaving a basket, her mind clearly elsewhere. She was older now, her movements stiffer, but her eyes had lost none of their sharpness. "He cannot stay here forever," Arthur said, sitting beside her. "What will we do with him?" Asmara didn't look up from her weaving. "The world is large. A man can get lost in these mountains. It has happened before." The implication was chillingly clear. A coldness seeped into Arthur's bones. He had trapped Leo, but he had never considered killing him. "No," he said, the word firm. "We can't do that." Asmara finally looked at him. Her gaze was ancient, weary, and laced with something he had never seen before: pity. "You are a good man, Mbesa. You have a soft heart. It is why we chose you. But you do not understand what it takes to survive." "I understand desperation," Arthur said, his voice low. "I understand what it feels like to have your world end." "No," she said softly. "You understand grief. That is the pain of something that is gone. We understood extinction. That is the fear of something that will never be." She paused, her eyes searching his. "You have never asked in all these years. You accepted the story we gave you, the story of the fever." Arthur felt a prickle of unease. "That's what you told me. A sickness that took the men." Asmara set down her basket. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the distant laughter of his children. There was no fever. "Arthur, there was no sickness from the gods." She turned her gaze back to the valley, to the terraced fields he had helped build, to the waterfall he had freed. Her voice was flat, a recitation of a history he had never known. "Our men. They were not all good men. Some were, but many were. Weak. They drank too much tella. They beat their wives. They saw the world changing, the government in the distance getting stronger, and they were afraid. 10 years ago, men from a mining company came. Foreigners. They offered our husbands a deal. Money, drink, rifles. In exchange for the rights to this mountain, they told the men they would all be rich. Arthur stared at her, his mind struggling to keep up. The company wanted the water, Osmera continued, her voice a dead monotone. "And the minerals in the rock, it would have strip-mined this mountain. It would have destroyed our fields, poisoned our spring, and they wanted more. Part of the deal was that our husbands would sell our unmarried daughters to them. In the camps, as servants, as whores, as the air went out of Arthur's lungs. We found out, Osmera said. The women. We talked. We wept. Begged our husbands not to do it. They called us fools. Said it was the only way to be strong. They had a meeting to finalize the deal. The whole village. They celebrated. Drank, and in their drink. We put the root. The root, Arthur whispered, his throat tight. A local plant. We use it sometimes to end a pregnancy that is not meant to be. In small doses, it sickens. In large doses, she trailed off, her meaning absolute. It brings a fever, terrible quick fever, and then silence. We, the women of Goshi, chose. Our daughters over our husbands. We chose the mountain over the money. We chose survival over our own souls. We poisoned every last one of them. Arthur felt the ground shift beneath him. The entire foundation of his life, of his purpose, crumbled into dust. He wasn't a savior who had stumbled upon a village of helpless victims. He was a pawn. He was the final piece in a long, cold, brutal plan. The prophecy of the man from the West. It wasn't a prophecy. It was a want ad. They hadn't just needed a man. They needed an outsider, someone with no connection to their violent, secret past. They needed new blood, untainted by the blood they had spilled. He looked at Osmera, at this small elderly woman, and saw not a wise matriarch, but a ruthless queen, a mass murderer who had sacrificed her own men to save her people. The women of Goshi were not victims of fate. They were agents of it. Their hands weren't just gentle and caring. They were stained with a secret so dark it could swallow the sun. His entire life here, his fatherhood, his purpose, it had all been built upon a foundation of mass murder. You killed them all? He breathed, the words catching in his throat. We saved Gochi, she corrected him, her voice as hard as the mountain stone. And then, years later, the mountain gave us you, the perfect man. A man with no family, no past that mattered. A man strong enough to give us sons, but soft enough not to ask the questions a harder man would ask. The twist was so profound, so complete, that it stole his breath. It reframed everything. His moral dilemma, his guilt, his pride, it all seemed laughably naive. He had been wrestling with his conscience while living among women who had sacrificed theirs on the altar of their children's future. Who was the real monster? The man who fathered 29 children out of grief and a desire to be needed? Or the women who had slaughtered their husbands to preserve their way of life? He felt a hysterical laugh bubble in his chest. And Leo is a man who asks questions, Osmera said simply. We have had enough of men who would lead us to ruin. Threat was no longer an implication. It was a statement of policy. Arthur stood up, his legs unsteady. He looked at his village, his home, and saw it for what it was. A fortress built on a graveyard, a sanctuary born of an unforgivable act. And he was its king, its prophet, its prize breeding stock. His power was an illusion, had never been. In control. He was merely the means to an end, chosen and managed by women with wills of iron and hands stained with blood. He wasn't a predator. He was prey. Prey that had been granted the privilege of thinking it was the hunter. Leo was gone. A week after Osmera's revelation, he disappeared from his hut. The official story, the one Arthur was instructed to tell, his older children, was that he had seen the wisdom of their life and had gone to find his own peace in the mountains. He didn't know if they had killed him or simply led him deep into the labyrinthine canyons and left him there, but the result was the same. The outside world was silenced again. The secret of Gaucher was safe. Years passed. The story settled into myth. Arthur aged. The white hair thinned, the blue eyes faded, the strong back stooped. He was no longer the Mbesa. He was the ABA, the father, and then the Ayat, the grandfather. His first children had children of their own. A new generation, with his eyes and his hair and his Mara's unyielding will, filled the village. They were the future she had killed for. He never spoke of. The secret with Osmera again. It lay between them, a vast, silent ocean. He was complicit now, a keeper of the truth, a prisoner of the paradise he had helped build. The moral ambiguity of his life was no longer a question to be debated in the quiet of his own mind. It was the very air he breathed. Was he a selfish? The old man who had created a dynasty to soothe his own grief? Or was he the unwitting tool of a people's salvation, a salvation bought at a terrible, bloody price? The answer was yes. He was both. He was neither. He was simply the man who had said yes. He sits now on that same smooth stone where Osmera once sat. She is gone now, buried on the cliffside facing the rising sun, a revered ancestor. Arthur is old, truly old, a relic from another world. He watches his grandchildren playing in the fields below. One of them, a little girl named Sarah, has his daughter Lily's smile and Osmera's sharp, intelligent eyes. She runs to him, her small hand warm in his wrinkled one. "Aba Ayat," she says, her Amharic perfect, her English a mirror of his own Philadelphian accent. "Tell me the story again. Tell me how you came to Gaucher." He looks at her, at this impossible child, born of grief and murder and hope. He is a prophet. He is a patriarch. He is a fraud. He is a father. He is a prisoner. His life is a triumph. And a tragedy, a beautiful lie built on a horrific truth. He no longer knows how to feel about any of it. All he knows is the warmth of this child's hand in his. He smiles, a weary, ancient expression. Clears his throat. The story is worn. And familiar as the stone beneath him, "It started," he says, his voice a dry whisper with a great thirst.